Hi everyone, welcome to Diabetes Primetime. Today we're talking with registered dietitian Danielle Bublitz about finding freedom with food, strategies for lowering blood sugar, and more. Before we get started, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and let me know if it's your first time joining us. Danielle, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as a dietitian, you really focus on helping people find freedom with food. Why is that so important, especially for people with diabetes?
So oftentimes for people with diabetes, when you get that new diagnosis, those doctor's office visits can be so daunting. You're there for about 15 to 20 minutes, you get a list of foods you can't eat, and you're on your way. And that sends a lot of people with diabetes into this mode of eliminate. And what I've found in my clinical practice is that, disordered eating becomes super prevalent in that diabetes space, and there's a lot of fear around food. So what I really try to help people with diabetes understand is that all foods can fit into your life, and let's learn how we can make that work for our blood sugars too.
Okay, I love this dual goal, fitting the foods we love into our life and making it work for our blood sugar. So how do you help people do both?
I try to figure out, okay, so let's put together a meal. So let's say somebody really enjoys rice. Okay, so you have your rice. What protein can we add in? What fat source can we add in? And what fiber? And the reason that I talk about carbs, protein, fat, and fiber is because when you pair those carbs with those other sources, it slows down the blood sugar spikes. I was diagnosed with diabetes when I was 16 years old, and that's really what spurred my interest into becoming a dietitian. As I was getting into my clinical practice and then starting my own business, what I was seeing time and time again were people coming in very afraid of food, and specifically very afraid of food because of the fear of what it's going to do to their blood sugars. Naturally, that's a very valid concern.
So let's talk about blood sugar. Why is cutting carbs not always an effective strategy for balancing our blood sugars?
When people are cutting carbs, the issue that happens is they may feel that deprivation from not allowing themselves to have the food that they really want. And, there's tons of low carb options. And sometimes people really do enjoy those low carb, tortillas or breads, things like that. But for the most part, if you have, you go to a birthday party and there's a slice of cake there, it feels really bad to think to yourself, I'm not allowed to have this. I cannot be present in this moment. And so we have to shift that mindset of you are allowed to have any food you want. The more you put that food on a pedestal, the more you're going to crave it. And I like to give an example of if you took a toddler to a museum and you told them, do not touch that painting. Whatever you do, don't touch that painting. What are they thinking about? They're probably thinking about, how am I going to touch that painting? So it's a very similar concept.
We're going to pause here and do our trivia question. Folks, if you answer this question in the comments, you'll get an awesome breakfast guide with recipes and tips for building a healthy, delicious breakfast. And you'll get it for free if you answer our trivia question, which is, Honeycrisp and Macintosh are varieties of what fruit? Is it A, apples, or B, mangoes? Put your best guess in the comments and you will get that breakfast guide delivered to your Facebook Messenger inbox. So I think a lot of times people are afraid, like if I kind of loosen my rigidity towards food, I'm just going to go completely to the other side of the spectrum and my blood sugar numbers are going to be crazy. How do you help people kind of find that balance of like enjoying treats in moderation?
So what I try to do is something called food habituation. So we go through the different foods that either the person feels really fearful of adding in or fears that they'll lose control with that food. And we'll slowly add them into their meals. So let's say, for example, I had a client that was like, I've been craving cookies. I won't let myself have them, but they would ultimately end up binging on those. So we would practice, okay, at your lunchtime, I want you to add the cookie with your meal. I want you to add the cookie. I want you to give yourself that permission, and let's see what happens. Let's take a step back and really just give yourself that space to enjoy.
So we've talked about completely cutting carbs, isn't going to work over the long run. Tell us, what are other strategies for keeping blood sugar in range that might be more sustainable?
There's so many different approaches for blood sugar management. There's 42 plus factors that can affect our blood sugars, which is crazy when you think about it. And yet we tend to hone in on just the food aspect. So when it comes to managing blood sugars, making sure that you're getting enough rest. I think sleep is such an undervalued way to manage your blood sugars because sleep is restorative. And there's been studies that show that if you're able to get 6 to 7 hours of sleep consistently, it actually decreases insulin resistance in the body. So sleep is definitely underrated. Another approach would be movement. And when I say movement, I'm not saying you have to be at the gym for 2 hours a day. If you like doing that, that's great. But even going on a 10 to 15 minute walk, maybe after a meal with your dog or with your partner, that will have huge benefits for your blood sugars. So sleep, movement, stress reduction, staying hydrated, making sure you're having enough water. That's also really important because dehydration will increase blood sugars.
So it sounds like checking blood sugar fairly frequently is really the way we can figure out what foods are right for us, what foods we can eat in combination. They're going to keep our blood sugar in range. How often do you encourage people to check blood sugar?
Yeah, it's very dependent on the person. Try checking first thing in the morning. Try checking after meals. Maybe try checking before you go to bed. Very dependent on each person, but I think that will really help to give you a lot of insight into if your medication is helping you, or how you can kind of work to pair different foods together to make that food fit into your life.
And when we're checking after a meal, are you usually recommending checking like 2 hours after a meal? And do you recommend checking before the meal as well?
Yeah. So again, super dependent on the person just because test strips can be very expensive. So I try to keep that in mind. It is absolutely helpful to check before a meal where your blood sugar's at. And then I always recommend checking 2 hours post meal because that's after the diet. If you check after an hour of eating, that's where your food is just breaking down. So it's not going to be the best way to view where your blood sugars are going. So I always recommend 2 hours post meal.
So, how do you help people manage cravings for those really sugary foods that can cause a blood sugar spike?
So, what I usually try to share with people is okay, this is a food that you're thinking about a lot. If this is a food that maybe you struggle with binging on, highly recommend giving yourself that opportunity to incorporate it into your, mealtime. Because another thing with blood sugar management is if you're adding, a little dessert with your dinner, that can also be a helpful tool for reducing that blood sugar spike because you're already having your protein, your fat, your fiber, all those other sources that are going to help reduce that spike.
So having a small dessert with dinner is probably a much better choice than having that dessert 2 hours after our meal, maybe when we're sitting in front of the TV.
Yeah, I mean, because it's gonna, if we think about the types of carbs, like you mentioned, it's like the sugary, it's more of a simple carb. They break down fast. That's the purpose of that carb. So if it's on its own, you might notice that you spike, and especially before bedtime, I could see that would be a little challenging before you go to sleep.
We have a lot of people report that there are certain times of day that are kind of like their most challenging, whether it's I'm just getting home from work and I really want a snack, or it's after dinner, I'm in front of the TV, I really want something sweet. How do you encourage people to work with those times?
I mean, I can just imagine, end of the day, you're exhausted, you're, wanting to have time to unwind and, food is emotional. So I can see, food is comforting at the end of those days. So something I always try to investigate with patients is make sure that, are you eating consistently throughout the day? And I'm super pro snacks in between meals and not going long times without meals just because, okay, imagine you're tired and you're hungry. It's going to be so hard to think rationally. And, especially because I take this approach, like an intuitive eating approach, where you are checking in with your hunger cues, you're getting home and you're like ravenous. So again, my main tips for my patients is let's make sure during the daytime you're eating enough.
So let's say we've had a day that didn't go the way we wanted from a food perspective. We've made choices that we're really not very happy about. Can you share some strategies that might help us get back on track, especially without feeling guilty?
Yeah, so I would first off say give yourself a little compassion because every day is going to look different. Even if you ate the same food every single day, your blood sugars could still have a different response. So, again, remembering that complexity around blood sugars. So, first, give yourself some compassion and think about let's move forward. Okay, what's my next meal going to look like? What can I add in? And that's the main theme of what I really try to help people with is what am I adding in versus what am I taking away?
Do you suggest that people think about healthy foods that they really enjoy? Kind of thinking about like, okay, I really love tomatoes and I really love cucumbers, for example. I want to make sure I'm adding those in to meals.
Yes, exactly. So sometimes I even come up with a list like, let's talk about it. What kind of carbs do you like? What kind of proteins? What kind of fats? And we just go through a list because sometimes people they're so focused in on what they can't eat. They just get into this decision fatigue of like, well, I don't know what to eat, period. So coming up with that list is super helpful. Like you like zucchini, that's amazing. What if you threw that into like a stir fry? So giving them more ideas of what they can do.
So Danielle, is portion control something that's important for people with type 2 diabetes?
I definitely think the types of carbs you're incorporating into your meals are going to have specific effects. Like we mentioned with the sugary kind of desserts. So those tend to be our simple carbs. And I always explain to people, simple carbs equals fast energy. It's, going to break down really quick. That's where that pairing comes in. Whereas if you're including maybe a complex carb, which is going to have some fiber attached to it, that's going to have a slower process of digestion. So it's when we're thinking of like the moderation aspect, I try to give people the idea of let's build your plate and let's think about and keep in mind how to make it balanced. For some people, again, like I mentioned, since I do work with people with eating disorders, I will not go into super specific numbers, but maybe some of my other clients, I'll say, all right, do we understand like what is a serving and what are two servings? How can we visually look at this plate?
Okay, so let's talk about that. That seems a little bit like the plate method. In general, if someone doesn't have some kind of eating disorder, how should they be thinking about building a healthy, balanced meal?
I usually share that plate method where we are doing like a portion of the plate that does have the veggies. We have a portion of carbs, portion of protein. I personally like to discuss the fat because I think it's not really listed on the plate and can confuse people. But if we're thinking about salads, adding in a dressing or adding in like avocado, adding in some sort of fat source is important because the fat source will help the fat soluble vitamins in the vegetables absorb well. So I try to explain that part, make sure that, when you're cooking, make sure you have some sort of fat that's included in that. So again, the plate method, including some of the fat source, talking about different fat sources you can use, avocados, having maybe like cheese if you like that, knowing where to add it in.
So I think it's interesting. I've never really heard anyone talk about fat allowing some of the fat soluble vitamins in the vegetables to be absorbed. So fat isn't only adding flavor and maybe slowing the blood sugar spike from the carbs in our meal. It's also allowing nutrients in the vegetables to kind of get unlocked in a way.
Yes, exactly. And whenever I think of adding fat to foods, I think of we're adding the satisfaction piece as well. Because how many salads have you had with no toppings, no olive oil or any sort of flavor, and it's just not a satisfying experience? Yeah, you're eating it. Okay, you got it in, but food should still be a satisfying experience.
In case you're just joining us, we're here with registered dietitian Danielle Bublitz talking about finding freedom with food, effective strategies for lowering blood sugar, and more. And we're giving away a super helpful breakfast guide if you answer our trivia question, which is, Honeycrisp and Macintosh are varieties of what fruit? Is it A, apples, or B, mangoes? Put your best guess in the comments and you'll get that guide delivered to your Facebook Messenger inbox. So if someone was recently diagnosed with diabetes, what are the most important things for them to know and keep in mind?
I would say give yourself a lot of compassion. It's really hard being diagnosed with diabetes and it's a huge learning curve. You're going to be learning every day. for years, and that's okay. You're going to find that some things work better for you for blood sugar management, and maybe a friend you have with diabetes may have something else that works. So know that what works best for you doesn't have to be the status quo. And also, I do want to say too, because I think there's a lot of shame in the diagnosis, I just want to remind people that diabetes is not your fault. Diabetes is very complex. I mean, we think about the different, causes of diabetes. We haven't been able to really link to one specific factor, but, family history, genetics, sometimes, women that have polycystic ovarian syndrome, their insulin resistance is high. When you have hypothyroidism, that can be, something that can be tightly correlated. Steroid use, as far as like for any respiratory illness, if you need to take a steroid. So there's lots of things at play. And I just want you to know that if you're stepping into a new diagnosis, this is not your fault. And there are definitely ways that you can manage your diabetes and live a healthy life.
Oh, I'm so glad. I love that message. Can you also talk a little bit about how the beginning, like those first few months, are really challenging, but it does get easier over time?
Yes. So the first few months, again, you're learning from scratch. You're learning from scratch, and diabetes, unfortunately, has a lot of stigma. So you're listening to lots of noise and chatter around you. I know for a lot of my clients, with type 2 that I talk with, it's the family members, it's the cousin that's comparing their cat's diabetes to your diabetes. And so I say that because give yourself a lot of space to process and know that, in those first few months, you'll be checking in with your doctor. You'll be doing those labs like for your A1C, and you'll kind of be falling into your own groove and your own patterns. So just take it one step at a time. It is a lot of info, but it's going to start making more sense as, the days go on.
So I know a lot of times when people are newly diagnosed, they feel like they need to change everything all at once. Can you talk about how someone might go about making small changes and like over what time frame?
I love small changes because it's a lot more reasonable. Depending on the person, I know for myself, I've chatted with patients and said, why don't we focus on one goal for this week? Let's check back in the next week. So if that works better for you, know that you don't have to conquer it all in one day. And we just won't. So choose one thing to work on. Maybe it's, okay, I'm going to start adding some more veggies into my meals. Let me look at that list that, I kind of wrote down some of those veggies I do like. Can I find a good recipe where I can add that in? Great. That's a great goal. Other goal could be, I'm going to make sure I take my medications. I'm going to be consistent with my medications. Excellent goal. All these things will serve you.
I'm so glad you said medication because that's such an important component of diabetes management. And sometimes we get so laser focused on food and exercise that we don't talk enough about medication. I know a lot of people feel like they should be able to get off medication. How do you talk to the people that you work with about the role of medication when it comes to diabetes and how taking it is not necessarily a sign of failure?
I love this question so much because I think it is such a universal experience for people with type 2. Usually at the diagnosis, they're trying to backtrack and I have to get rid of this diagnosis. But the medications are absolutely supportive and very helpful. We think about with any other condition, if you have celiac disease, if ulcerative colitis, whatever it might be, any other condition, if your doctor said, hey, here's your medication, this is going to help you, we would probably take it. But with the medications for diabetes, there's a lot of stigma, and it's not a failure if you need it. Absolutely not. It's going to help you and it's going to make your life easier. And one thing I want to add too is a lot of times the patients I've seen that are restricting a lot of carbs, it's like they're fighting against the medications that are there to assist them. So I just want to encourage you that those medications are supportive and there's nothing wrong if you are prescribed them. You haven't failed.
Any advice for the folks watching at home about how to avoid stress and burnout that's related to diabetes?
Definitely making sure that you take things slow, a few goals at a time. I think a lot of times we try to take it all on, and emotionally it's overwhelming, physically it's overwhelming. So knowing that you can only tackle so much in a day, and also understanding that diabetes burnout is so real. Like a lot of people go through that, so you're not alone. Um, there's some really great, Facebook communities, different like local groups. Sometimes even the community support can be helpful to see that you're not alone in those feelings.
So one comment we always see on our Facebook page is that fruit is bad for people with diabetes. So let's talk about that. Is fruit okay for people with diabetes to eat?
100%. Fruit is great. And, fruit has vitamins and minerals, it has fiber, it's excellent. So again, think about what are we adding in? Think about the fruits you do like. Can we pair them? Can we do like a snack where we're having like an apple and some peanut butter, or maybe we're doing like some grapes and string cheese? Pair up those fruits with a protein and fat, and yeah, definitely enjoy them because it's okay and it's helpful to have fruit in your diet.
What about smoothies?
So there are some ways that you can create a smoothie that is helpful for balancing your blood sugars. Because again, talking about complex or simple carbs, if you're having a smoothie and it's solely just fruit, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's also no protein or fat that can help slow down that digestion of the carbs. So oftentimes I suggest, throw in a protein source. Maybe you have a protein powder, Greek yogurt, maybe some peanut butter, like whatever it is that you like, throw in those protein sources. You can also, some people like to throw in a little bit of like a veggie, like spinach. Great. So throw in a little more fiber. There's different ways you can make those smoothies so that it's a little more balanced for those blood sugars.
So it sounds like we're approaching a smoothie almost like we would a meal. We want to make sure it's got a little protein, some fat, some fiber, along with kind of the carbs.
Exactly. So I like to think of things too as like having a blood sugar toolbox, It's like, what tool can I use today? So know that it's not just one thing that you can do for managing your blood sugars. It's kind of like, what tool can I use today?
So I love this idea of the diabetes toolbox. What are some of the tools in our toolbox? We've talked about balanced meals, but what are some other things that people can be thinking about?
Timing of when you're taking your medication, that's an important tool. Thinking about how you can manage your stress levels, that's also important. Making sure we're staying hydrated. What kind of movement can we get in? I also like to throw in self-compassion as a tool. I know it seems like, okay, well, is that really doing anything for my blood sugars? It's more so helping you with your mindset, because it's very easy to go into that diabetes burnout, diabetes shame, and then we kind of feel paralyzed. So that toolbox can have many different things, but just know that it doesn't have to be one tool, just medicine or just cutting all the carbs out, which, I don't think is going to be the most helpful for most people.
So you mentioned earlier that you're a big fan of snacks. Tell us some good travel snacks for people with diabetes. Like what should we be taking with us in the car, on a trip, etc.?
Yeah, I personally really like having things that don't need to be refrigerated because you just don't know how long you're going to be out. I really love like Kind bars, different types of like granola snack bars that have some protein and some fat in them. So you can always take a look at that nutrition label and see, okay, is there some protein? Is there some fat source in here along with the carbs? I find those to be very helpful. I've also found even those little like trail mix packs. Some stores sell little trail mix packs. So you could do that because, you're getting a little bit of carb in there. You're getting some protein and some fat, and it's just easy to keep in your bag. You don't have to worry about the refrigeration. So I really like those two. For those that do prefer something like maybe having a string cheese, you could always pack maybe like a bag of crackers, handful of crackers and some string cheese, throw it in your bag.
Oh, I love those suggestions. So you have a program, you work with people with diabetes about kind of figuring out which foods are right for them and how they can really enjoy foods while still keeping blood sugar in where they want it. Tell us about your program. We'll put a link to it in the comments, but I'd love to hear from you. Kind of what are you trying to help people to achieve?
It's a self-paced course that includes some quarterly lives. It's called Fundamentals of Intuitive Eating and Diabetes. And I usually open it up every, 3 months. I add in like new content, just like you mentioned with what snack ideas. I try to throw meal ideas, snack ideas, smoothie ideas, all the things that people are thinking about when it comes to how do I make my meal work for my blood sugars. And then, yes, I try to hop on these quarterly lives so I can answer people's questions and kind of form a community, because I think that's so important. Just as you have this Facebook community, which is vital, I think, just for people to not feel alone. That's what I've tried to create with this kind of self-paced course.
Last question is an important one. You described self-compassion as an important tool in our diabetes toolbox. How can someone at home start practicing self-compassion in their diabetes management?
So oftentimes I try to ask patients, when they're bringing up some of these negative thoughts or negative reactions to looking at their blood sugars, a doctor's appointment experience they had, what they ate on a certain day. I try to ask them, what if your brother said that to you? What if they were telling you, or a friend? What if a close friend said, "Hey, I totally screwed up today and I ate X, Y, and Z." What would you say to them? Because likely you would be way kinder to somebody else than you're being to yourself. And so really kind of journaling that out and recognizing how those thoughts are impacting you, because they do. We are the toughest critics on ourselves, yet we would give somebody else compassion. I would hope we would give somebody else compassion. So from that point, I usually, say, okay, so you've kind of identified that you would be a lot more compassionate with someone else. You deserve that exactly what you would say to that person, you should say to yourself. You should journal it to yourself. Take some time and really process that. And from that point, you can take action steps, which would be, okay, my blood sugars spiked after this meal. That didn't feel great, but that's okay. That's one blood sugar reading. This isn't the whole picture. What can I do next time? Or what can I do right now? Can I go do an activity that will kind of calm me down, that will relax me? Basically, what can I do to care for me?
Oh, I love that. So self-compassion isn't just necessarily the way we're talking to ourselves. It's also the actions we're taking on our own behalf. And a lot of times when those voices aren't so harsh, we're able to see more clearly kind of the action we can take next.
Yes, exactly. And I think that also can really alleviate a lot of that diabetes fatigue and burnout, because if we're constant, can you imagine just having this voice in your head every single time you check your blood sugar saying, you failed, you messed up? It's like, yeah, I would be burnt out in 24 hours. That would be very hard. So just recognizing those thoughts, reminding yourself how you would respond to someone else, let yourself know that you can have that same compassion, and let's move forward. What step are you going to take to care for yourself?
Danielle, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
And a big thank you to everyone watching at home. We so appreciate you being here and chatting with us in the comments. Before we go, here's the answer to our trivia question. Honeycrisp and Macintosh are varieties of what fruit? The answer is A, apples. If you didn't get to answer the question, but you'd still like that awesome breakfast guide, just leave a comment for us and tell us what you thought of the show. We will be back with a new episode in a few weeks. Until then, please stay safe and take good care. Good night.